Well, I mean, just for your viewers who don't know my background, I started in newspapers in Scotland in the 1970s, and then I joined AFP News Agency, which is one of the main three international news agencies in Paris in 1984. So I worked in France for 8 years on what we call the English desk, which was the English editing desk, international editing desk. Then from 92 to 96, I was 4 years in the Middle East, which is talking about challenging, is a very challenging place to work. And then I was the Asia editor in Hong Kong between 96 and 99. So I was responsible for the organization of the Hong Kong handover, which, as you can imagine, was a big challenge because sometimes stories like that are more difficult because it's one event, right? There's going to be a handover at midnight. You're not going to get an exclusive that they changed it to 11:30 at night, okay? So then you've got to build the story into something interesting and not do what everybody else is doing necessarily. So that was quite challenging. Then from 99 to 2005, I was editor-in-chief of AFP. I was the first non-French editor-in-chief of AFP. So I was responsible for a network of more than 2,000 journalists worldwide working in about 5 main languages. And so I was responsible for events like the coverage of the attacks on 9/11, the war in Iraq, Afghanistan, the Asian tsunami, the death of the Pope. So a lot of big stuff. And unlike the Hong Kong handover, I mean, 9/11, you didn't expect it. You know, it was 3 o'clock in the afternoon in Paris. So these are challenging moments for journalists when you have to really, think on your feet, as we say. But that's why you become a journalist. And since then, I've been in Asia pretty much nonstop since 2012, I would say. Yeah. So, I mean, coming back to what you were saying, I mean, the first question is the difference between French, English, American journalism. The styles are different, obviously. I would say the French press is very varied politically. It's called quite politically marked, It's very free and very vibrant. I would say the British press, which I grew up with, I think the curse of the British press is the tabloid journalism, which, for example, in the run up to Brexit, published all these front page stories against Muslims, against migrants. Quite a lot of it was fake or exaggerated. So I think that's always been an asterisk against British journalism, where, of course, there's a lot of great British journalists. I recently did an event at the FCC with Alan Rusbridger, who's one of the great ever newspaper editors, the former editor of The Guardian. United States, the media there is becoming extremely polarized. And, you have what Trump labeled the mainstream media between the Washington Post, New York Times, CNN, and then you have an increasingly extreme right-wing media, even right-wing of Fox News, like One American News Network. You have the social media now called Parler, right? That must have been Freudian that I forgot it. Parler, spelled like parler in French. And these are completely detached from reality. I mean, they just make it up as they go along. They publish stories saying that Trump won the election when he hasn't. So, I mean, the media landscapes are quite different. What I would say, though, one thing that binds them is that I wrote the ethics for AFP, which is like the code of good conduct for journalists, don't take freebies, things like that. And I did a big research on it before I wrote the ethics document. And you can find it, if you look at AFP Charter online, you can find it. It's also in Chinese. We translated it into simplified Chinese in partnership with Hong Kong University. And what I found was that France, America, Britain, elsewhere in the world, the big media organizations have certain values: accuracy, seek the truth, transparent and rapid corrections, don't profit from your position as a journalist, a duty of care to people you cover. So I would say that despite all the differences, there are common values. And I think that was the one thing that really struck me, So I'm a past president. I'm currently vice president. I'm a co-chair of the co-convenor, they call it, of the Press Freedom Committee, and also co-convenor of what we call the Professional Committee, which organizes events. So there's a kind of synergy between the two, obviously. So I would say we do, we have a sort of three-pronged approach to this. And I felt it was important to write that article to really explain why we do what we do. And it's actually written down, you know, because not all members of the club are journalists. So I think also some of the non-journalists who might not be clear or who haven't been in the club that long, but it says Foreign Correspondents Club for a reason. So the first thing we do is we issue statements, and we're not alone in that. This is you know, any advocacy group around the world will issue public statements. And obviously if journalists are imprisoned or harassed, if things happen, you issue a statement. I always quite like issuing a statement that actually adds something to the discussion. I'm not terribly keen. Sometimes you just have to do it, but I'm not terribly keen on just issuing a statement saying the FCC condemns or XYZ condemns, because nobody really wants to read. It's kind of, you know, everybody kind of expects you to do that. So I think it's good if you issue a statement to try to add something to it, like, you know, can we discuss it? Can you revise it, or whatever? I mean, it might often, or call on other people to put pressure on governments or whatever. You know, we focus on Hong Kong, but we also have an international suite, particularly when it comes to, for example, Asia. And so issuing statements helps. It doesn't always achieve something. I mean, in the case of, for example, a hostage situation, if somebody's in jail, it's very important to keep it in the public eye. Like we took up the case of the 2 Reuters journalists in Myanmar who were jailed. And I think the public outcry, the constant pressure, the constant statements helps support these people. Maria Ressa in the Philippines is facing a 6-year jail term, similar. So that's one thing we do. Very rarely we'll issue a joint statement. We tend to speak on our own. And then if other organizations like the Hong Kong Journalists Association issue statements, we'll publish them on our website. And then, of course, we share our own statements on social media. So that's one thing. Number 2 is we believe in dialogue. In the past year or so, we've had 2 meetings, a delegation of the board, including me, had 2 meetings with the police. And we constantly talk to members of the government. We have an open invitation to the police to come and talk to the club, which they haven't taken up. Sometimes we find what is roughly called pro-establishment figures in Hong Kong. Sometimes they're a bit reluctant to the club, but we always invite them. You always need balance, because I'm impartial. I mean, I want to hear all voices, and the best voices you can hear are the ones you don't agree with, because the ones you agree with, you know what they're going to say. So we're very open to dialogue. And CY Lung came last year. I think it was last year, which was maybe, yeah, it was last year. I don't think it was earlier this year. Anyway, he came quite recently. So we have a variety of voices. And we met the Foreign Ministry as well. We went up to the MOFA. So I think dialogue is important, both to express our concerns about press freedom, and also to hear what, you know, the official side, what their view on journalists is. And this is a discussion, we can talk on this later, the question of the amateur journalists covering the protests. The third is active, because press freedom is also about safety of journalists. And during the protests, we held a series of morning briefings, morning workshops, to which we had security experts in on how to, your personal safety, covering a protest, cybersecurity, legal issues, and we opened it up to members of the HKGA and also student journalists. So I think that's important also to do that. We had a panel discussion on the implications for journalists in the national security law with a couple of lawyers, and often that's more useful. I mean, you can have a discussion about the pros and cons of the national security law, but I think for a journalist, it's very useful to know where are the lines, or where do you think the lines will be. So I think that's the 3-pronged approach: statements, dialogue, training. Yep. It was done with no dialogue. I mean, we've sat down twice with the police, as did the Hong Kong Journalists Association. and the Hong Kong Press Photographers Association met the police. And the first thing we knew about it, it was published. I mean, I sat down with the police and I understand their concerns. I mean, they're faced with, I mean, I've never seen so many journalists covering a protest. I mean, you have dozens and dozens of them, and a lot of them were very close to the police. Obstructing or assaulting a police officer is against the law. It doesn't matter if you're a reporter or not. So there are laws for that. If a policeman tells you you're obstructing, you got to stand back. You got to stand back. That's the law of the land, and it's the same in Britain, America, France, wherever. So you don't. That's to me, it's a different kind of issue. The police raised a lot of concern that a lot of I like to call them amateur reporters. I don't like the citizen journalist tag so much. I think it's a bit out of date, and it sounds a bit. Has a sort of slight advocacy feel about it. But I think these amateur journalists, they played an essential role in the coverage of the protests. And I think a thing I said to the police was, this is the new reality. You know, you have professional journalists, you have journalists working for AFP, CNN, Reuters, AP, whatever, and then you have this, and this is a reality that we have to recognize. And I spoke to a lot of journalists who were on the field, and okay, sure. I mean, maybe there were a certain percentage of people dressed up as journalists who weren't, or protesters, or whatever. But it was a sufficiently small percentage that it didn't merit that kind of action. Also, by taking away the Hong Kong Journalists Association, the best thing is, well, governments and police should not decide who journalists are. It's not their job. Okay. You know, police keep order, government runs Hong Kong. It's not up to them to tell me who a journalist is. So if there's going to be any form of regulation or ID system, it should be the media themselves to do it. And I think that the Hong Kong Journalists Association system is good. They have a press card. You can't just send in 2 selfies from a demonstration and get a press card from the Hong Kong Journalists Association. It's got quite a strict criteria. And that was and the Hong Kong Press Photographers Association as well. So both of these became invalid after the new police regulation. And I think that was a real avenue to try and regulate to some extent who's a journalist and who's not. And then you will also just have people who go down and want to cover it for their blogs or online who won't qualify as a journalist. And I think you have to recognize that this is how it works now. And I mean, if you see and again, I said it was in the police interest, you see the terrible video of the man being set on fire on the bridge. I was an amateur. We saw the circumstances of that. We saw the circumstances of when the policeman, the first shooting of the demonstrator, when the student, I think it was a student journalist, followed the demonstrators were chasing the police, and then they were cornered and they were hit, and then he shot, and then there was a petrol bomb came in. I mean, if you hadn't seen that, you wouldn't know. So I think, and major media used that footage. I mean, that was an essential part of the coverage. So, so I think that's something that should be revisited, and we should discuss it. I think, for example, in France, because if the government or the police decide you're a journalist, they can also decide you're not a journalist anymore if they don't like your coverage. It's a bit different from accreditation. Is not strictly the same thing. So, for example, if you work in New York, you get the police department's accreditation, and you can cross police lines, and they decide who can do that and who's not. Not a question of, they don't decide if you're a journalist or not. They decide if you're a freelance from an established freelance or a media, you get the press accreditation. So if the Hong Kong police want to only issue press accreditations to their press briefings, that would not be unusual. Okay. However, the Hong Kong police turn around and say to someone at a demonstration, you don't work for a recognized news organization, you're not registered with the Government Information Service, so you're not a journalist, you can be arrested for example, illegal assembly. So that's in a public place, doing your work as a journalist. So that's, to me, that's more problematic, okay? The system of issuing accreditation, I mean, just try going to go to the rugby sevens without having accreditation from the organizers. You wouldn't get through the front door. So journalists, just saying I'm a journalist doesn't get you access everywhere. But certainly in the situation in Hong Kong, I mean, there's a real legal jeopardy now for people who just go down a couple of events. There's very little anecdotal evidence since. I had a meeting with the Hong Kong Journalists Association. I think they were very disappointed in that decision. I think they also find there's a lack of dialogue, which is frustrating. We've tried dialogue and it didn't really get anywhere. And they said that there's only been, I think the only kind of demonstration since that came in the national security law came in was October the 1st. And the police were seemed to have been pretty relaxed. They checked people if you had the JA press card, they seemed to let you go. So, but I think also a lot of freelancers held back because they were frightened they might get arrested. So, yeah, it's not an easy question to answer, actually. Yeah. And I think the impact it had was it took away the sense of a firewall between the mainland and Hong Kong. You knew if you went into mainland China, there were restrictions on where you could go, what you could say. It wasn't always clear, but it was there. But in Hong Kong, you pretty much say what you liked, and that changed. So that was a big, that was the big event. Suddenly, you're facing the same sort of challenges in Hong Kong. And I think it's very difficult. I mean, it's one thing for people with international experience. I mean, AFP, we work in China, we have an office in North Korea, I worked in the Middle East. So working in a difficult environment, you know, under certain rules or whatever, you can adjust as an international media. I think it's obviously been a shock for local media who's suddenly, having had complete freedom, suddenly are asking themselves, what can we do, you know? I think without getting into the actual law itself, I think the interesting thing for journalists is how does it affect your coverage as a journalist? And I've spoken to a lawyer about this, meaning, say a political activist says something which breaches the national security law, okay? And can face arrest or whatever, that's a different thing. Can you report what he said or she said? Okay. Under journalistic privilege. The answer I got from the lawyer, and it's not really been tested, I don't think, in court, has been yes, you can. Okay, I've seen reports of slogans, whatever, that breach the law being reported in the media, and so far I've not seen a follow-up. So, you know, but the problem in any situation like this is it's very grey, you know. You're living in a grey, it sounds like a bit of a mixed metaphor. You're kind of working in a grey zone surrounded by red lines, but you don't know the red lines until you cross them. So that is what has what we call a chilling effect. So people start to self-censor. People don't want to talk in forums like this because they're worried they'll say the wrong thing. Can you republish a photograph from the protest that has a slogan that would now breach the law? Can you republish that? I mean, as of now, the answer seems to be pretty much yes, you know. Can you make a flag out of it and drive around Hong Kong? No. So I think the question is still quite open in the national security law, but generally it's had a chilling effect. Another thing it's had an effect on has been people's social media presence, because a lot of people were very outspoken on social media, as you know, including journalists, and suddenly they're thinking, help, you know, should I be following these people? Should I have sent that tweet? Should I have retweeted that tweet? Should I take it down? So it's had quite an effect, you know. Yeah. I mean, I know Jimmy Lai. I mean, he just sat opposite him a couple of years ago when he spoke at the FCC, and I bumped into him more recently. So, and a lot of my colleagues have interviewed him. I mean, he is a symbol of press freedom in Hong Kong. I mean, you put him in jail, you send dozens, if not hundreds of police into the Apple Daily headquarters, you lead him away in handcuffs. I mean, how is that not going to be perceived as an attack on press freedom? I mean, the optics alone. I mean, the question is the intent. You say it's deliberate. I mean, what's the intent? Were the optics to scare everybody else? I mean, but for Jimmy, this is not new. I mean, he's always been outspoken, as you know. He's always been a fierce critic of the mainland government, Chinese government. He's very critical of the Hong Kong government. I mean, he's an outspoken person, and I think he's suffered through. And I think there's been essentially an advertising boycott of the Apple Daily, and he's you know, even prior to this, he's been arrested before. As you know, he was stopped outside his house. So this is not a new. Jimmy is a symbol of press freedom, has been under attack for years in Hong Kong. So this is a continuation. Of course, the difference now is the severity of this accusation. But I mean, if you look at Borders Without Borders, the FCC, the Committee to Protect Journalists, everybody is, you know, is clear. This is an attack on press freedom. Yeah. You know, whether the government or whatever the prosecution says, that's their business. But I mean, from a media point of view, yes. I think there've been a lot of, I mean, apart from Jimmy was the highest profile, but over the past year, 18 months, quite a few journalists have been arrested at the protests, for example, you know, and they weren't all charged, they were detained. Some got into confrontations with the police because they didn't want to show their ID and stuff like that. So there was a lot of tension running. So, I mean, I think you have to separate that a bit from the national security law and what I went back to, are you breaching this national security law? So I just don't know. You cannot tell. I mean, Jimmy Lai, I mean, at the same time, he's a symbol of press freedom, but another time this has been an ongoing thing for years and years and years with Jimmy Lai. So he was always seen as target number one. So I don't know. I don't have an opinion. I mean, you know, and things have moved very quickly, as we know. A lot of people are going into exile. Mark Simon, Jimmy Lai's assistant went into close collaborator went into exile. So it's unpredictable. The immigration department never explains why, and it's not just the Hong Kong. That's fairly typical, I think, of immigration departments around the world. So, I mean, you can actually, under the Freedom of Information Act or whatever they have here, you do have the right to look at the file. So I don't know if you've looked at the file of the reasons, because it can be redacted, but you can actually get into your file. So I don't know why I just don't know why that was turned down, to be honest, you know. Was it because of the Hong Kong Free Press, or was it some other reason? I cannot answer that. On the broader question of visas, I mean, now you're getting into Jimmy Lai and the other issues tend to be kind of the local media. Then you get into the question of the international media. I mean, there are two concerns for international media, and which often, apart from the actual pure press freedom issues, which influence how you operate in a country, and that is, can you get visas for your correspondents coming in? And are your local journalists or staff under any form of threat or intimidation? So touching on the visa thing, again, I think this is why you also have to be fairly balanced in your approach. For example, there was a lot of delays for visas over the summer. Okay, and the FCC issued a statement. We thought that maybe under the national security law that things had slowed down, there was more scrutiny, and there seems to have been more scrutiny, but at the same time, we're in the middle of a pandemic, right? So come September, October, I think almost all of the visas, a large majority of visas for international organizations were actually granted, you know. I know the New York Times is sending a lot of staff to Seoul, to South Korea. They're kind of reducing their staff here. So we have to see longer term on the visa situation. I think some visas have come under more scrutiny than usual, but again, is that specific to journalists or is it more general? Okay, because I know, like, for example, I was speaking to somebody yesterday who's a cafe pilot, and and said that they're being much tougher on visas for pilots. Obviously, the situation doesn't help. So but that's definitely something we have to watch is the visas situation. I mean, you normally, if you apply for a visa, you have to prove a local person can't do the job, which is the same the world over again. So obviously an international media organization, it's quite easy to explain that we need language skills, we need people who have had experience outside of Hong Kong. So, but the visa issue is one. But another thing you have to remember as well is that when it comes to American journalists, the Trump administration has been extremely aggressive towards Chinese media. They reclassified Chinese media. I don't know if they call them foreign agents, or there was some other reclassification of them. They put strict limitations on visas for mainland journalists who are in the United States already. So the Chinese clamped down on visas in the mainland in particular, and they also said it could apply to Hong Kong, was in retaliation to the Trump administration's crackdown on Chinese journalists in the United States. So, you know, that's a tit for tat situation. And the FCC's actually, I think, in one of its statements, actually just defended the Chinese journalists and saying that the Trump administration shouldn't be using journalists as pawns in their war against this campaign they've got against the Chinese government. So you also got to look at what's happening on the other side as well. But visas are an issue, but we'll have to see how that goes. Yeah. You know, look at the reality. Jimmy Lai is in handcuffs in jail. Hundreds of police go through the Apple Daily offices. An RTHK reporter was arrested for doing a very simple kind of online search to try and find out, I think, who owned, it was a license plate search, and the police come into our door at 7 o'clock in the morning. Journalists covering the protests were pepper sprayed. Somebody I know well, Baby Mega, an Indonesian journalist, was hit point blank range by a rubber bullet and lost an eye. Police have refused to identify the policeman who did it. If that was in the United States or France or Britain, you would know who it was. There would have been some form of legal action. They've just covered it up. Police have been able to act with impunity. The Hong Kong Journalists Association had their request for a legal judicial review rejected a couple of days ago by a judge about the police violence against journalists in Hong Kong. The Hong Kong went down from 18th to 73rd in the last Reporters Without Borders Press Freedom Index. I was just asked to fill out the form for this year, the questionnaire for Reporters Without Borders this year. When you go through the questionnaire, I mean, you know, what would before have just been, you know, you mark them 1 to 10, you would just marked everything 1 because this was totally free. Now it's quite a different matter. So there's no argument. I mean, press freedom has suffered in Hong Kong. Yeah. And if you don't believe that, you're denying the evidence of your own eyes. Fake news in Hong Kong, I think you could, you know, fake news, I've just finished writing a book about it, but it's not published yet. I mean, fake news is a sort of generic term, which covers a lot of things. It covers disinformation, which is when people deliberately put out information that's wrong, right, to mislead people. Misinformation tends to be the description of spreading information that they think is right but isn't. Like maybe you see a fire, you see smoke coming out of a building, and you take a picture and you put it online saying this building's on fire where it's not. There's a bonfire. So that's misinformation, not necessarily harmful. And then you have all sorts of other things, you know, your conspiracy theories and everything. But I mean, just to lump it all into one big box of fake news, I think the fake news, I think the most striking thing was probably it started around the umbrella movement, actually. when you first used to get fake news here about things that were going on in the umbrella movement. Fake news surrounding the protest, there was a lot. Quite often, you know, you get fake news when there's an absence of information, like the alleged killings at the MTR station. Remember, was it Prince Edward or Jordan? I can't remember. They were saying 3 or 4 people were killed. It was a cover-up. I mean, logically, that is not going to happen in Hong Kong. But I mean, so there was a lot of that. I mean, I wouldn't particularly put it down to the amateur journalists. I think if you're an amateur journalist, sometimes you can only show one side of the story. You show somebody being pepper sprayed, but you don't show them throwing the stone at the policeman. So, I mean, I think more of it might have been maybe misrepresentation, but I mean, I think the main sort of fake news problem in Hong Kong was deliberate, just rumors spread on social media, messaging apps, messaging groups, and both sides were playing that game, you know. And then, of course, we had the toilet paper situation, you know. And this is, I think, where your responsibility as a journalist comes in, because it's called amplifying the rumor. So if you report that you know, social media, or, you know, netizens or whatever you want to call them, are reporting that there's going to be a shortage of toilet paper coming from China, so you got to stock up. And then people rush and create the shortage. So you're amplifying the problem. So you can't just amplify what goes on social media. So, I mean, I wouldn't blame amateur journalists for the fake news thing. I mean, this is just something that's the world over. Look what's happening in the United States. Look what's happening with now the vaccine. So, I mean, Hong Kong, I mean, I thought this was a crazy kind of Hong Kong story, the toilet paper, and then it was in America, and it was in Australia. So, yeah, I mean, fake news is an issue. And so how do you fight that, really? I mean, people really have to, you know, the platforms are doing their best, you know, they keep tagging Trump's tweets. They keep saying this election information isn't whatever, is disputed, where in fact they're just giving them a platform to keep saying you win the election. You've got to be your own gatekeeper when it comes to information. You have to decide your sources of information, you know. Platforms are not going to do it for you. I mean, the Facebook can do its best, but I mean, I have so many feeds of so-called friends on Facebook that just keep repeating all this stuff about the coronavirus is a fraud, vaccine is a fraud. I mean, it's just, so you have to take the responsibility yourself on when it comes to that. You have to decide, what are your news sources? I'm not going to believe what's shared by my friends and my parents. If I've never heard of this news outlet before, I'm going to check it. You know, if it sounds too good to be true, it probably is too good to be true. So the fake news thing is, yeah, it's a big topic, which I can talk about another day, you know. But I wouldn't blame amateur journalists going down to protests with their phones for spreading fake news. But as I say, sometimes in the heat of the moment, if you're not a trained journalist and used to these situations, you can misrepresent the situation, you know. Also, you can make something look worse than it is, you know. Somebody puts a little fire in the street. If you put yourself from the ground behind it and take a picture, it looks like the whole place is on fire. So, you know, this is why I wrote the ethics, and obviously AFP and other professional photographers don't do that. But it's very tempting if you're an amateur and you want to sell your picture freelance to make things look a bit different, you know. I mean, I think in Hong Kong, I mean, there's still a lot of press freedom in Hong Kong. It's getting worse, but I mean, the situation is a source of concern. But obviously, international media are not under the same kind of pressure, I think, that local journalists are, which is the same the world over, actually. It tends to be the local journalists are more in the line of fire. When it comes to trusting media, I mean, I don't like the concept of trust. Trust implies a leap of faith in a way. I prefer people to make their own value judgment on why a media outlet produces credible information. So I'm not going to say to you, I work for AFP. It was created in 1835. It's based in Paris. It's been around a long time. We've got 180 bureaus and 2,000 journalists. Trust everything we say. No. What I would say to you is, why should you trust AFP or Reuters or AP or New York Times? You go online and look at the ethics charter. What are the rules this news organization works by? If you look at an AFP, if you go into the document, as I say, you can look at the AFP charter. There's 3 documents. There's the AFP charter, which is like there's a guiding main principles. Then there's the ethics, which goes into a lot of depth and what you should do and what you should not do. And there's also a document on sourcing, because sourcing is very important, which you're talking about anonymous sources. And if you look at that, so you look at a video of an AFP video or an AFP photo, you will know the rules by which that was taken and edited. Okay. If you look at say we use an anonymous source for some reason, you can look up why we use an anonymous source. Okay. You go to other outfits like Breitbart or InfoWars in the States, for example, you're not going to get that. So I think people should make their own judgment. This is why, not just because of the name, why should I believe this? And I think transparency. And one thing I like at the South China Morning Post actually is that they print I quite like the fact they always have a little sort of picture and idea of the reporters who worked in the story, you know. I think you should be as transparent as possible. Another thing is, I think you should be as transparent, and I think it's good, obviously doesn't work so much for print, but online, put the original links. If you cover Carrie Lam's speech, put the link to the speech so the person can go and see themselves. I mean, you decide what's newsworthy or not, but maybe you're biased for one reason or another. So I think that links are good. I think people should be able to go back. I think it's changed now. I think people should be able to go back to the original sources of information. I mean, I think if FCC comes out and criticizes a police decision, I think people should go back and read the original police document and see what they're saying, what their reasons are. So I think more information, not less, but it's got to be quality information. And also just Googling things doesn't always work. Because if you Google, you know, the vaccine gives you whatever, well, measles, if you Google, you know, measles vaccine gives you autism, you're going to find a lot of websites that say it's true, where it's fake. So just because you find corroborating evidence on Google doesn't automatically mean it's true, you know. So, but yeah, I think you have to take your own responsibility. Of course, a lot of people don't care. And there's that dopamine fix of just sharing crazy stuff, and then you get lots of likes. You know, if you don't get any likes, it's a waste of time. But so I mean, that's the whole question of we're coming back into social media. But as I say, I think for trust in the media, I think you should. It's so important now, particularly in a situation like the coronavirus or what's happened with the national security law. I think people should read the national security law before they have an opinion on it, you know. Then you read journalists, they don't like it, they like it. Politicians defend it, they criticize it. Well, at least you know what they're talking about. And then you can make your own decision. Yeah. Well, again, I think you just have to use multiple sources of information. I mean, what I did during the protests was, I mean, I watched it. I don't think any protests have ever been covered like the Hong Kong protests. And I mean, I watched it on Now TV. It was just this incredible live stream from, I think I saw this poor guy getting shot at 8 o'clock in the morning, the second protest that was shot. So, I mean, it was pretty graphic and it was all day long. And so it was interesting to be seeing it for yourself and then reading about it. I mean, I just think people just have to, the gatekeepers have changed. You know, the South China Morning Post and AFP is a news agency which distributes to media. I mean, I think you have multiple sources of information. I don't think that the fact that you have amateurs getting stuff, I mean, you know, media organizations have limited staff. We don't have all that many eyes and ears on the ground. And even I think big organizations rely so much on freelancers and also amateurs and students. So I don't think that affects the trust. But the task where the trust comes in is that if it's somebody, I've got on Twitter, I'm quite active on Twitter, and I've got a list for Hong Kong, and what I found over the protests was there was certain people were down at the protests, amateur journalists, not maybe freelancers, and they were consistently posting stuff that proved to be accurate. Okay, it wasn't other people's stuff. It was their own stuff. They were down there and it was accurate. And then if you looked at 3 or 4 others, they were posting similar things because they're in the same place. So that gave you a pretty good picture. But other things, if you get something exclusive, and where it comes in with a bigger media organization is that you verify it, because a lot of this stuff is also out of context. It's protests from before. There was quite a famous one, I think, from the protests, which was I think it was a rioter in France, and the picture was supposed to be a policeman and somebody, I don't know what was going on, but it was not in Hong Kong. So it's very easy. I mean, this now big media organizations have full-time staff verifying this content, So if a big media organization takes that footage and posts it online, it's been verified as real, It's very easy for them with the tools now to quickly verify, was this in Hong Kong today? Or was it in Belarus 6 months ago? So I think that is important, and people, I don't think, have the time. You can, if you spend a bit of time, you can learn to use these tools yourself, but I don't know how many people would do it. But it's very dangerous. If somebody's posting something and you just share it without really checking if it's original or if it's real, then that's how fake news gets spread, So, yeah, again, coming back to, it's professionalism. It's a code of ethics. It's the tools to check that it's right or not, So, I don't think you should believe everything you see. Of course, online, there's a lot of fake stuff for it. And also, I think a lot of the so-called fake, when it comes to images, video, and photo, I would say a lot of it is actually misrepresented or manipulated, more than totally fake. I remember a few years ago there was terrorist attacks in Belgium, and there was footage that came up suddenly of, I think it was supposed to be the airport in Brussels, and it was an attack in the Moscow underground system. So I think a lot of the fake stuff is actually just manipulated or out of context. It's much easier to do that, or even just put words in people's mouths. You talk about deep fakes, which is, really creating a completely new, taking your image and just creating a fake video with you saying something, where it's much easier just to take a real video and then just overdub it with your own voice saying things out of context or editing it. That's a lot less effort and be quite effective, particularly if people are just watching it on a smartphone. They're not going to pay attention. They're not going to look at the lips, So that is the big problem with the amateur footage. But I felt in Hong Kong, I didn't, there was the deliberate fake news, but I didn't get the impression that the people that I was following, and a lot of them out in the protests, were making stuff up. And there was more than enough to cover without having to make stuff up. Let's put it that way. If you work for the local media, it's difficult to, you got to be professional and take your personal feelings out of it. It's not, I would say you got to also, again, I mean, it's good to be impartial as a journalist, but traditionally media, the press has been biased, politically biased. You know, the Washington Post and New York Times are clearly liberal in the American sense of the word. Fox News is conservative. So that is not new. And I think that you got to draw the line between having a political bias that people know about. So if I buy the Daily Telegraph, I know it's going to have a conservative slant. If I buy the Guardian, it's probably going to have a kind of left, liberal left of centre slant. I mean, that is why rich people buy newspapers. Okay, that's why there's a difference. I think you have to draw the line, and this is why I criticised the British tabloid press, Fox News, when to push your political point, you spread falsehoods, things that are not true. Okay, which Fox News did. I watched them. More on the opinion side than on the news side, but still, Sun newspaper, you know, Christmas is cancelled because of Muslims, because some local town council decided not to put a tree up or something, and they just take it to a ridiculous extent. I mean, so you're pushing an anti-Muslim, anti-migrant line, and you're distorting the facts. That's different from just having a political bias. Okay, saying that the Conservative Party, we should leave Brexit because it'll be good for Britain. But if you start publishing Islamophobic fake news so that people will vote to leave Britain, you're crossing a line. So in itself, the press, newspapers, and to a degree, radio stations, particularly in America, and televisions have a political bias. I think a public broadcaster, and this is different from a state media. State media publish the viewpoint of the government, okay? It's government control. Public broadcaster receives its funding from the government, but is independent, like RTHK is independent. It's under a lot of pressure at the moment, RTHK, but it's independent. So they should be impartial. AFP as a news agency, Reuters and AP, you follow their coverage. They cover the news as it is. They're not pushing an editorial line. I think I can say that. I can't speak on behalf of the competition, but I think that's a fair comment. Having been the editor-in-chief of AFP, you're accused of it, because sometimes you don't cover, if you cover the Arab-Israeli conflict, the Palestinians are never going to be very happy with your coverage, and the Israelis are never going to be very happy with your coverage. And I always say that means you're doing your job, okay? But I mean, I think a big international agency, public broadcasters, you should strive for, obviously, impartiality. But I mean, the reality, which I think people don't like to hear, is that the reality has always been political bias in the press, the media balance. You know, if you go back, look at your history books, 19th century, Seymour, you know, William Randolph, Joseph Pulitzer, you know, the history has always been political bias, but that shouldn't lead to falsehoods, which is a problem, you know. But I think your journalists, I mean, that tends to fall into the opinion piece. It should not affect your actual covering of an event, right? You cover an event. If you go down and cover an event, you should just tell it the way it is. You shouldn't, you know, you should try and be as dispassionate as possible. The bias comes more from the press baron who says that write an opinion piece saying that we should do this or that, you know.